As already said, our topic is Ethiopia, more precisely current ornithological research in Ethiopia. My name is Gedeon and my co-author is Till Töpfer. We have been working together on Ethiopian birds for many years, and I would like to present some of our results of our joint studies. And when I say current research, I mean research that we have started or completed in the last 10 years or so. And I would like to emphasize that in addition to Till and myself, several other people were involved in the field work and the evaluation of the data, not least from Ethiopia. So let's take a closer look at the following 5 projects: Ethiopian bush crow, black-fronted francolin, Ethiopian Dracos, new martin, question mark, and finally an ongoing project checklist and range maps. But to begin with, brief remarks on Ethiopia's natural features. As you know, the country is on the Horn of Africa. It is characterized by an impressive variety of topography and landscape. Large parts, especially in the north and in the center, are covered by mountains with peaks reaching over 4,500 meters above sea level. The Rift Valley runs from southwest to northeast across the country and widens into the Afar lowland, which in some areas lie even below sea level and are among the hottest areas on Earth. To the west and east, we find extensive savanna and scrublands crossed by some large rivers, such as the Blue Nile or the Shabelle here. And as for the biome, we can assign most of the area to the Somali Maasai biome. Parts of the Sudan-Guinea savanna biome penetrate the country from the west, and in between the Afro-tropical highland biome dominates. Now let's go to our first species, the Ethiopian bush crow. One of the most interesting birds in the Horn of Africa, in my opinion at least. Wonderful and very social creatures with black and white plumage and blue-colored skin around the eye. We will come back to this in a minute. The species is endemic to Ethiopia, and the range is restricted to a tiny area in the south of the country, near the Kenyan border. You can see the red dot on the map on the left. And the question that drove us was, why on earth does this species have such a tiny range? The bush crow inhabits open acacia savanna on a vast plateau at altitudes of 1,000 meters or more above sea level. And at first glance, this landscape does not differ from other habitats that we can find in the wider area. We did some modeling and were able to show that land cover predicts the occurrence of the species, at least to some degree. We can see the results in the map on the bottom right. The actual range is outlined with a red line here. And that's also where the highest probability of occurrence is predicted, shown in a more intense coloring of the red orange. However, we also applied another model using only climate and altitude data. And it turned out that this model predicts the probability of occurrence much better than land cover. In a nutshell, the species area of occupancy is delimited by a pocket of climate that is cooler, drier, and more seasonal than surrounding areas. The predicted probability of occurrence was low outside a very narrow range of mean annual temperature of 17.5 to 20 degrees Celsius. And that means we are obviously dealing with an extremely climate sensitive species. And what we did next was look more closely to another feature of the species that we believe are related to thermal stress and the appropriate adaptations, respectively. One of the striking features are the huge tower-like nests, which are usually built in the top of trees or shrubs. And this is really amazing when you see the size of the build and the huge construction. And it's a huge burden for the builds to build such a structure. And inside this nest consists of a long entrance tunnel and a nest chamber here on the bottom. And outside the nest is encased in a dense cluster of twigs. And this nest, of course, provides good protection for enemies. However, our assumption was that the elaborate construction also serves to regulate temperature and thermal stress for the breeding parents and nestlings. Therefore, with the help of a thermal camera, we measured the temperatures in different zones of the nest during the course of the day. And it turned out that the lower parts of the nest, where the nest chamber is located, the temperature was lower than in the upper part, at least during the hot daytime. The nest where this is located, the temperature was much lower, and although the difference was not high, the nest construction seems to contribute to the reduction of thermal stress inside the nest. Let's look to another unique feature. I already mentioned the blue-colored skin around the eye. But what it's even more remarkable is the fact that the birds have an extensive patch of bare skin behind the eye. And the birds are able to expose this patch at will by spreading the feathers behind the eye. And I think this is I don't know any other species who can do like this. And we can see this page here very clearly. And again, we use the thermal camera to assess the heat dissipation of the body's surface. And as expected, the highest heat emission was at the bare spots on the head here. And again, we hypothesized that this trait contributes to the thermoregulation of this heat-sensitive species. And then at this point, I would like to refer to further studies that Andrew Blayton has carried out in the course of his PhD studies in recent years. He and his colleagues discovered that, for example, foraging behavior is also determined by temperature, much more so than in other species in the same habitat. And his modeling has also shown that the species will probably be extinct by the end of this century under all currently conceivable climate scenarios, even with only moderate warming. In fact, no good prospect at all, and what is worse, no obvious solution, at least for the moment, for this wonderful species. Let's move to another endemic, the black-fronted francolin. Until a few years ago, the species was considered a subspecies of the chestnut-named francolin. When we started our fieldwork in 2012, atrifrons had not been recorded in the wild for several decades. Luckily, we rediscovered the population and were able to take photos and record sonograms for the first time. The phenotypic traits clearly supported species segregation as previously proposed by Nigel Collar. And furthermore, we were able to show that atrifrons here can also be clearly differentiated genetically. Based on all this data, the species status of atrifrons is now generally accepted. And again, we are dealing with a species whose range is very limited to a region in the extreme south of Ethiopia. Our fieldwork and modeling showed that the bird can only find suitable habitats in the mega mountains near the Kenyan border, represented in yellow to red colors here in the map. And these white striped areas are parts of the Borana National Park. And that's really pity. You see, almost the entire range of the black-fronted francolin is outside the protected area. We have therefore made specific proposals as to which areas should be added to the national park. And we hope that these suggestions will be taken up by the responsible authorities. However, the region is hardly accessible at the moment due to civil unrest and the resulting security risk. The good news is that the species has now received international attention. We provided our data to the IUCN Reds list team, and the joint assessment resulted in Perennistes atrifrons being placed in the endangered category. We hope that the ridge will soon be accessible again and that effective on-site monitoring can be established as well as habitat preserving measures. Turaco is next. The white cheek turaco is widespread in Ethiopia and a few neighboring areas. Until very recently, it was thought to be divided in two subspecies, the nominate form Leucotis with a dark blue crest, and Donaldsoni, you see here with the crimson crest. And this crimson crest in Donaldsoni seems to be quite unremarkable, but we will get to that in a moment. Perkash and his colleague have made a rough genetic study on the turaco found in Ethiopia. And on the one hand, they were able to prove that all Ethiopian species differ from all other members of the turaco genus. And they therefore assigned all Ethiopian turacos to the separate genus Menelik ornis. And furthermore, it was found that Leucotis and Donaldsoni are genetically distant and should therefore be treated as separate species. And the third close relative with a tiny range in Ethiopia is Ruspulis turaco. And while its species status has never been disputed, the separation of Donaldsoni from Leucotis has remained controversial despite the genetic difference. On the map, you see the range of these three forms, Leucotis here in most areas, Donaldsoni here in a small pocket only, and Ruspoli here in the south. And the crucial question to be answered was now, are the two forms, it means Leucotis and Donazzoni, are sympatric in the field? If so, then that was the final argument for granting species status. So we investigated this question in the Bali region of Ethiopia, and what we found was very clear. The range of Leucotis and Donazzoni overlapped to a considerable extent. And also important, no hybrids have been observed in this overlap area so far. So we are clearly dealing with separate species, Donazzoni, as a crimson-crested turaco. And by the way, it's also a new endemic for Ethiopia. And if I may briefly come back to the crest, when the bird is in an excited state, you can see it here, then this crest and its coloring is very remarkable. And such crests play a role in courtship, and perhaps it's a trait that's much more important for species separation than previously thought. An assessment of the endangerment of the crimson-crested turaco is still pending, but what we already know is that its habitat is about to disappear. The birds inhabit mainly podocarpus forests, among other tree-rich habitats. And in the picture above, you can see the remains of such a forest, but still used by turacos. And in the picture below, such a stand has already been destroyed. Further investigations and probably protective measures are urgently needed. And let's move to another species, or rather to the question, is it a species at all? What we see here are birds with easily recognizable characteristics. The overall coloring of the plumage is grayish. The throat and belly are white. The forehead and mask in front of the eyes are blackish. And finally, there is a thin light stripe above the eyes. And this combination of features has not been described in any species of the genus Riparia so far. The plain martin is the closest relative with the distribution in the Horn of Africa and beyond. But when we compare the birds, we hardly see any common features. In fact, we have found the grayish martins in several areas in Ethiopia, some of which are rather far apart, shown here in the red squares. And all of these localities are within the range of the plain martin, indicated by black circles. In Ethiopia, the plain martin is represented in two subspecies, Truensis and Minor, and both have brown breasts and throats, distinctly different from the grayish white-bellied birds that we have observed. In short, we assume that the grayish martins belong to an undescribed species. Unfortunately, the Ethiopian authorities have not given us permission to collect and export genetic material so far. Nevertheless, we published our results last year, but without establishing a scientific name. We hope that we will be able to submit the genetic data in the foreseeable future. As a result, we might have another endemic species in Ethiopia. At last, but not least, a few brief comments on an ongoing project. The taxonomy and classification of birds has undergone a number of significant changes in recent years. And a noted checklist of the birds of Ethiopia was published in 1971, a good 50 years ago. And the Atlas of Distribution by Ash and Atkins was published much later in 2009. However, most of the data was collected in the 1970s and before. And with this in mind, it seemed appropriate to update both the checklist and the distribution maps. And for this purpose, we have processed our own observations and the records of colleagues known to us. And we have evaluated in the current literature too. And the resulting paper was published as a preprint in the summer of this year. And in providing such a preprint, we hope to receive more data, comments, and feedback in the coming months so that we can complete the project hopefully in 2023. As for the results, just a few maps. Here you can see the half-degree squared from which we were able to collect new records. That is data not included in the last atlas. The coverage looks not too bad. Excuse me. Looks not too bad, despite some gaps, especially here in the vast area in the west. But if we look at the species density, we see a very clear pattern. In the areas along the Rift Valley, we find the most species, here indicated in green, but also in some other areas around Addis Ababa or near Lake Tana in the north. And few species, however, were found in the squares to the west and especially to the east. And what's the reason? And as far as we can see, most of this differences is an artifact due to missing data in the areas shown in red. And it shows us clearly where the atlas activities need to be intensified in the future. The range map for each species look like this, with the squares representing the Ash and Atkins records and dots representing the new observations. I have selected here a species that is common and widespread in Africa, but has its distribution limits in Western Ethiopia along the Sudanese and South Sudanese borders. Or so we thought. New findings indicate that the green woodhuppers spread well into Tigray in the north and other parts of the country where it was previously unknown. We arrived at the last slide. The peregrine falcon is also a species with a wide distribution in Africa, but it is by no means common. Most observations concern migrants or Palearctic winter visitors. So far, there have only been 2 confirmed breeding records from Ethiopia, and we were able to add 2 more, shown here by the large red filled circles. Furthermore, we were able to document several records during the breeding season in suitable habitats, especially in the southeast. Apparently, the species is also more common and widespread as a breeding bird than previously assumed. What the example also shows is that when we make surveys, we should not only record observations, but also information on reproduction, habitat, and so on. And we lack such data for many species, not only in Ethiopia. I would like to leave it at these 2 examples, especially since another presentation is planned specifically on checklist and atlas topic, maybe earlier next year. Some final thoughts. I touched on a few issues today, but of course there are countless other research topics that need to be addressed in conservation and climate change, taxonomy, biogeography. In German, we have a proverb that says it's only a drop on a hot stone. And for sure, we need more research on all these topics. A second, more ornithologists at the universities are needed. During the last 20 years, many new universities were established in Ethiopia, but in hardly any university we have ornithologists, and we need this specialists, and we need better capacities for training students. Most publications and for to get master degrees or bachelor degrees are done in doing assessments in protected areas also, and that's a really good thing, but it should be expanded to other topics in the universities. And for this, we need specialists there. And last but not least, I think it's necessary to establish citizen science programs, for example, for Atlas project and monitorings. We know in Southern Africa, in Nigeria, in Kenya, such programs are established now. And my wish for the future is we should also do this for Ethiopia to get more and better data. So that's all for now. Thank you very much for your attention, and any questions and comments are welcome. وطا فلقا شقاونا